Mason Carter wanted only one thing: his final paycheck after months repairing a neglected fleet of jets. Instead, Amelia Grace, the arrogant chief executive of Aeronova, hurled his contract onto the concrete and laughed coldly. "Sue me." She had no idea the quiet single father standing before her had already logged every unauthorized flight order, every forged signature hidden inside her company's records. Before night fell, Mason walked into the rain carrying a folder addressed directly to a federal aviation investigator. Before sunrise broke over the runway, her entire empire had been sealed shut. Wherever you're watching from, whatever kind of day you've had, stay with me until the end. What Amelia Grace said to Mason Carter that night would be repeated back to her, word for word, inside a federal hearing room less than a week later. To understand how that happened, we need to go back 3 months, to the day Mason first walked through those hangar doors. The hangar sat outside Newark, New Jersey, a private facility Aeronova leased for 18 months at $210,000 a month, a figure the company liked repeated in press coverage because of how large it sounded. Mason had been brought on 91 days earlier, hired through a maintenance staffing agency after Aeronova's in-house crew fell behind on inspections for a fleet that had grown faster than anyone bothered to service it properly. He asked for nothing beyond what his contract promised: $18 an hour above standard rate, paid every 2 weeks, and a final settlement once the backlog was cleared. He had a daughter waiting for him most nights, a 9-year-old named Ruby who he had raised alone since her mother passed 3 years earlier. He never mentioned her at work. He never mentioned much of anything at work. Mornings for Mason started at 4:45, not because the job demanded it, but because Ruby did. He made her lunch before he made his own coffee, packed it in the same faded blue lunchbox she'd had since 2nd grade, and left a note folded inside the napkin most days. Nothing elaborate, just a line or two. "Have a good day. Proud of you." He never signed them. She never asked him to. His sister, Denise Carter, watched Ruby after school 3 days a week, the other 2 covered by a neighbor named Pat Alvarez, who charged him $30 a day and never once raised the rate in the 3 years since Mason's wife Carol had passed. Carol's death had come quickly, a diagnosis in March and a funeral by August, and Mason had spent the 11 months after that learning how to braid hair from online videos and how to explain to a 6-year-old why her mother wasn't coming home. He didn't talk about that period, not with coworkers, not with friends, not really with Denise either. He carried it the way he carried most things, quietly, and kept moving. The contract job at Aeronova paid better than anything he'd had in 4 years, and he needed it to. Ruby's asthma medication ran him almost $90 a month even with insurance, and the used Ford pickup he drove had a transmission that groaned on cold mornings and would need replacing within the year, a repair he'd already priced out at just under $2,200. He kept a small notebook in the truck's glove compartment where he tracked expenses in pencil, not because anyone asked him to, but because it was the only way he'd found to stay ahead of a life that gave him very little margin for error. At the hangar, the younger technicians barely noticed him. He didn't eat lunch with the crew, didn't join the group chat where they complained about supervisors, didn't linger after shifts to talk about anything beyond the work itself. To most of them, he was simply the contractor, older, quieter, competent enough that nobody questioned his signatures, invisible enough that nobody remembered his name without checking his badge first. Lucas Owen, the operations director, knew him only as a line item, a subcontracted rate paid out of a maintenance budget he was constantly trying to shrink. Mason didn't mind the invisibility. He'd built a life around not needing to be seen, only around getting the work done right, going home and making sure Ruby had what she needed. It was that same quiet discipline, the habit of checking every detail twice before signing anything, that would matter more than anyone in that hangar could have predicted, starting with an inspection he began on a Tuesday morning that looked at first like every other inspection he'd completed before it.
Tuesday morning began routinely, the way most mornings did. Mason arrived at 6:30, badge scanned in, coffee in a thermos his daughter had picked out for him 2 Christmases ago, chipped now on one side, but still holding heat the way it was supposed to. His assignment for the day was tail number N448AN, a mid-sized jet that had come in the night before for what the schedule listed as a routine 48-hour inspection window. He started the way he always started, walking the exterior first before touching a single panel, letting his eyes do the initial work his hands would confirm later. 22 years in the industry had taught him that most problems announced themselves quietly before anyone else noticed. A slight discoloration, a seam that didn't sit quite flush, a smell that didn't belong. He'd learned to trust that first pass more than any checklist, though he never skipped the checklist either. The aircraft looked clean, almost too clean. The paperwork attached to it, printed and clipped to a board near the cockpit door, showed a maintenance history that read like something out of a training manual. Every box checked, every date logged, every signature legible and consistent. Mason had seen thousands of these logs over 2 decades, and something about the uniformity of this one caught his attention before he could explain why. Real maintenance work done under real time pressure rarely looked this neat. He moved to the fuselage near the forward cabin door, running his palm along the metal the way he always did, feeling for anything a visual inspection might miss. That was when his hand stopped. A hairline fracture, barely visible, sat low along a seam near the door frame, precisely where structural stress would concentrate once the aircraft reached cruising altitude and full cabin pressure. He knelt down, pulled a flashlight from his toolbox, and angled it low across the surface. It wasn't damage that belonged on a jet cleared for passenger flight. He examined it closer, tracing the edges with 2 fingers, and noticed something else. A section of material near the fracture didn't match the surrounding metal exactly. A patch, applied carefully enough to pass a casual glance, but not carefully enough to fool someone who'd spent his career learning what proper structural repair looked like versus what a shortcut looked like when someone was trying to save time. He photographed it from 4 angles, the way Hannah Madison had taught him years earlier during an unrelated case. Documentation first, conclusions later. He measured the fracture's length with a small ruler he kept inside his toolbox, noted the measurement in his notebook alongside the aircraft's tail number and the date, then turned his attention to the maintenance log again, looking specifically for any record of impact, structural repair, or follow-up inspection tied to that section of the fuselage. There was nothing. According to the paperwork in front of him, that section of the aircraft had never required repair of any kind. It had passed its last 3 inspections without a single note attached to it. He called over Connor Isaac, a young mechanic who'd been with Aeronova a little over a year, quiet by nature, the kind of person who did his job carefully but rarely spoke unless someone spoke to him first. Mason asked him plainly what he knew about this particular aircraft's recent history, whether it had been involved in any incident, hard landing, ground collision, anything that might explain a repair this significant going undocumented. Connor's eyes moved toward the office windows before he answered, a small gesture, almost involuntary, but one Mason recognized immediately. It was the look of someone deciding how much silence was worth protecting. "I don't know anything about that," Connor said, though the hesitation in his voice suggested otherwise. Mason didn't push. He'd learned long ago that people rarely opened up under pressure, only under patience. He thanked him, let him walk back to his own assignment, and spent the next hour reviewing the physical logbook kept in the maintenance office, the original handwritten version, rather than the digital summary most people relied on. It was there that the inconsistencies multiplied. Signatures that were supposed to belong to 4 different inspectors looked nearly identical in stroke and pressure. Recorded inspection times overlapped with shift schedules that showed those same inspectors clocked out or working on entirely different aircraft. Parts listed as newly replaced, when Mason checked their serial numbers against the physical components in front of him, turned out to be the same parts that had been installed years earlier. None of it was proof of anything catastrophic on its own. A single inconsistency could be explained away as clerical error, a rushed shift, and overworked technicians signing in the wrong place. But Mason had spent 2 decades learning that patterns rarely lied even when paperwork did, and what he was looking at wasn't one inconsistency, it was a structure, built carefully enough to survive a casual review, and built by someone who understood exactly what regulators looked for and had taken the time to avoid it. He closed the logbook, set it back exactly where he'd found it, and stood for a long moment beside the aircraft, aware that whatever he'd just uncovered was no longer a question of a single fracture. It was a question of how deep the pattern went and how many people already knew about it.
Lucas Owen found Mason still standing beside N448NA 20 minutes later, having heard from Connor that a contractor was asking questions about aircraft history. His tone was friendly, practiced, the voice of someone who'd smoothed over 100 small tensions with charm rather than honesty. He asked what the holdup was, mentioned the tight turnaround before the next scheduled flight, and suggested Mason simply finish his checklist and let the senior team handle anything unusual. Mason explained the fracture, plainly, the mismatched patch material, the missing repair record, the signatures that didn't align with the shift schedule. Lucas listened, nodded along in the way people nod when they've already decided not to hear something, and told Mason the paperwork had almost certainly been consolidated during a system migration the previous year. Nothing sinister, just administrative cleanup that occasionally left gaps. Mason asked whether a structural engineer had reviewed the patch directly. Lucas said the internal team had already cleared it, that Aeronova's inspectors were among the best in the industry, and that a contractor brought on for 90 days didn't need to second-guess a process that had kept the fleet flying successfully for 6 years. By early afternoon, a senior technician named Grant Whitfield, someone Mason had never worked alongside before, arrived to look at the fracture himself. Grant examined it for less than 3 minutes, ran a hand over the patch, and declared it cosmetic, a surface-level repair from a minor ground incident, nothing requiring further documentation. Mason asked to see Grant's written assessment. Grant said a formal report wasn't necessary for something this minor, and walked away before Mason could ask anything further. By the end of the day, the flight schedule for N448NA remained untouched, still listed for departure at 7 the following morning, the fracture beneath its cabin dismissed by everyone except the one person who had actually measured it. That night, Mason stayed 2 hours past his shift, waiting until the hangar emptied out before returning to the aircraft one more time. He wanted to be certain, not for anyone else's benefit, but for his own. A wrong conclusion carried real consequences, and he had no intention of raising an alarm built on anything less than solid proof. He pulled the digital maintenance database up on a shared terminal near the office, cross-referencing every technician credited with inspecting N448NA over the past 4 months. 3 names appeared repeatedly: Grant Whitfield, a technician named Roberto Diaz, and one listed simply as D. Kwan. Mason checked employee records posted near the break room, the kind meant for shift scheduling rather than security. There was no D. Kwan currently employed at Aeronova. The name had left the company 7 months earlier, according to a farewell card still pinned to a cookboard near the lockers. Someone had continued signing inspections under a departed employee's name for months after that employee stopped working there. Mason pulled the physical logbook again, comparing D. Kwan's older signatures from before the employee left against the newer ones. The pen pressure was different. The letter formation was subtly off, close enough to pass a glance, wrong enough to matter under real scrutiny. He photographed every page bearing that signature, cross-referenced them against 3 other aircraft in the fleet, and found the same name attached to inspections on 2 more jets scheduled for flights within the coming week. The pattern wasn't isolated to one aircraft or one careless afternoon. It was systemic, deliberate, and had been running for months without anyone questioning it. He sat in his truck afterwards, engine off, phone in hand, staring at photographs that no longer represented a simple paperwork error. 3 aircraft, falsified signatures, missing repair records, and 1 fracture positioned exactly where a real structural failure would begin. Somewhere inside that pattern was a decision, made by someone, to let it continue anyway.
The following morning, Mason arrived early, before most of the maintenance crew, and requested a formal meeting with Lucas Owen before the scheduled 7 o'clock departure. Lucas agreed reluctantly, clearly annoyed at having his morning interrupted before the investor tour scheduled later that day. Mason laid out what he'd found, without embellishment: the fracture, the mismatched patch, the falsified signatures under a name belonging to an employee who no longer worked, and 2 additional aircraft carrying the same signature on inspections dated months after that employee had left. He requested formally that N448AN be pulled from the schedule and grounded until a certified structural engineer completed a full inspection. Lucas's expression shifted for the first time, something harder replacing the practiced charm from the day before. He told Mason this was exactly the kind of overreach that got contractors terminated early, that raising unverified claims right before a critical investor visit could cost the company millions in lost confidence. Mason repeated his request, calmly, without raising his voice, and handed Lucas a printed copy of the signature comparison, along with the employee departure record. Lucas took the papers, glanced at them for a few seconds, and set them aside without reading closely. He told Mason the flight would proceed as scheduled, that Aeronova's legal and technical teams had reviewed the aircraft, and that a contractor questioning internal procedure needed to remember his position within the company. Mason asked one final question: whether he was willing to put that decision in writing, with his own signature, confirming the aircraft was fit to operate despite the concerns raised. Lucas hesitated just slightly before saying that wouldn't be necessary, and walked away toward the office where Amelia Grace was preparing to greet the investors arriving within the hour. Mason stood alone near N448AN for a long moment, the folder of evidence still in his hands, the flight still listed for departure in less than 3 hours, and no one inside that building willing to stop it. By 9 a.m., the hangar filled with a different kind of energy entirely. Investors in tailored suits moved through the space alongside Amelia Grace, who walked ahead of them with the practiced confidence of someone showcasing exactly what she wanted them to see: polished aircraft, quiet, compliant staff, a schedule running without interruption. Mason stood near N448AN with his folder, waiting for the moment she would pass close enough to speak. She noticed him before he said anything, glancing at her watch first, making clear she had little patience to spare. Mason spoke plainly, describing the fracture, the falsified signatures, the departed employee whose name still appeared on active inspections, and the 2 additional aircraft carrying the same pattern. For a brief moment, something in her expression flickered, as though she were actually weighing what he'd said. Lucas interrupted almost immediately, insisting Mason had misunderstood standard procedure and was simply trying to stretch out his contract for additional payment before his departure. One of the investors, a man introduced only as Richard Hale, asked casually whether the fleet had any issues worth discussing. Amelia answered with a practiced smile, assuring him everything remained fully under control. Mason handed her the photographs and the signature comparison directly, along with the employee departure record. She barely skimmed them, her attention fixed instead on the discomfort rippling through the investors standing nearby. She asked Mason, in front of everyone, whether he had anything substantial enough to justify jeopardizing a deal worth this much money. Mason told her plainly that if the aircraft took off as scheduled, she would be knowingly placing passengers in danger. The hangar went quiet. Every technician within earshot stopped moving, watching to see how she would respond to being challenged this openly in front of the very people she was trying to impress. Amelia's jaw tightened. She looked at Lucas, then back at Mason, and demanded Mason sign a document certifying the aircraft was fit to operate, insisting it would put an end to the disagreement immediately. Mason refused.
Amelia's voice dropped lower, sharper, aware that every person in that hangar was watching her handle this. She told Mason a contract technician held no authority to bring her company to a standstill over what she considered an exaggerated concern. Mason answered that aviation safety regulations existed above any title, including hers. The words landed hard, and in front of investors she'd spent weeks courting, the humiliation cut deep. She glanced around, aware that Richard Hale and the others were no longer making polite conversation among themselves. They were watching her. Lucas leaned in close, his voice low but urgent, telling her that conceding anything now would be read as weakness, that a single grounded flight could unravel months of careful positioning with people who did not tolerate uncertainty. Amelia absorbed that the way she absorbed most advice that confirmed what she already wanted to believe. She turned to Lucas and told him to prepare termination paperwork, right there in front of everyone. Lucas returned within minutes, holding a termination notice along with a payment stub reduced to $612, justified by a note claiming Mason had failed to complete his assigned work. Mason looked at the figure and understood exactly what they were attempting. He asked, calmly, that the company cover the outstanding repair costs and inspection fees already owed to him, and that the flagged aircraft be grounded until it received a proper safety review. Amelia laughed, sharp and dismissive, suggesting Mason was playing the wronged hero, a contractor manufacturing sympathy rather than raising a real concern. Mason reminded her he'd submitted internal warnings on 3 separate occasions and received no response from anyone in leadership. Amelia snatched the papers from Lucas and threw them onto the concrete near Mason's boots. She looked at him with open contempt. "Sue me." The hangar fell silent. A few employees lowered their eyes. Mason bent down, picked up the papers without a word, and looked past her toward the aircraft still scheduled to depart within the hour. Mason said nothing else. He folded the termination papers once, tucked them into his jacket, and turned toward the hangar doors. Lucas called after him, something about remembering his place among people more important than himself, but Mason didn't slow down and didn't look back. Connor Isaac watched him go from across the hangar, guilt written plainly across his face for having stayed silent the day before. Amelia assumed she had won simply because Mason walked away without a fight, mistaking his composure for defeat. She turned back to Richard Hale and the other investors, offering a smile meant to erase the last 10 minutes entirely, and the tour continued as though nothing had happened. Outside, a light rain had started, the kind that soaked through a jacket slowly rather than all at once. Mason walked to his truck in the far corner of the employee lot, opened the passenger door, and pulled out a waterproof case he'd assembled the night before, the same one holding photographs, signature comparisons, the employee departure record, and copies of 3 internal warnings he'd submitted through Aeronova's official reporting system, each one ignored. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, engine off, rain tapping against the windshield, and called Hannah Madison, an aviation attorney he'd worked with years earlier during an unrelated safety case. She asked whether every document had a clear, legitimate source. Mason confirmed everything came directly from work he'd been assigned and inspections he'd personally conducted. Hannah's response was brief. If that aircraft still had a flight scheduled within hours, there was no time left to pursue anything through a courtroom first. Mason looked back at the hangar, glowing faintly behind the rain, and made his decision. He wouldn't sue her. Not yet. First, the people responsible for keeping aircraft safe needed every piece of evidence he had before that jet ever reached the runway.
Mason drove to a diner near the airport, one with steady internet and few enough customers that no one paid attention to a tired man working alone at a corner table. He didn't go home first, even though exhaustion pulled at every part of him. He glanced once at a photo of Ruby on his locked phone screen before turning it face down and opening his laptop instead. He organized the documents with methodical care, arranging them by aircraft, by defect, by the falsified signature attached to each entry, and by which scheduled flights carried the greatest risk. Hannah Madison joined him through a video call, guiding him toward language that stayed factual rather than emotional, reminding him the report needed to read as a record of evidence, not a personal grievance. At 11:15 p.m., Mason submitted an urgent safety report through the FAA's official reporting portal, attaching a formal request for inspection before N448AN's scheduled 7 a.m. departure. He sent a duplicate directly to Daniel Reyes, a federal aviation investigator he'd worked alongside years earlier during a counterfeit parts case. For a while, only an automated confirmation appeared on his screen. Then, at 11:41 p.m., his phone rang. Daniel asked precise, methodical questions: the aircraft's tail number, the exact location of the fracture, the name attached to the falsified signatures, the time of the next scheduled flight. Mason answered each one without hesitation. Daniel went quiet for a moment after the final answer, then said that if the documentation held up, this was no longer a contractor dispute. It was an active safety threat involving a passenger flight scheduled to depart in under 8 hours. He told Mason to stay reachable and began making calls of his own, waking 2 colleagues who would need to be at Newark before sunrise, assembling an emergency inspection team while the rest of the airport slept, unaware that a fracture the size of a fingernail was about to ground an entire fleet. Connor Isaac couldn't sleep. He sat in his apartment a few miles from the airport, replaying the moment Amelia threw those papers at Mason's feet, replaying his own silence when Mason had asked him directly what he knew. At 1:20 a.m., he sent Mason a text. Lucas had come back to the office an hour earlier and was quietly having boxes of records moved out of the maintenance office, loaded into a service vehicle near a side entrance rarely used at that hour. Mason told him not to take any unnecessary risks, only to document the location of those boxes if it was safe to do so. Connor sent a photograph minutes later, boxes stacked near an unmarked van, time-stamped 1:34 a.m. Mason forwarded it immediately to Daniel Reyes. Daniel understood the danger of waiting. If those records left the property, proof that could not easily be recovered would disappear with them. He contacted airport security and moved his team toward the Aeronova facility before 3 a.m., avoiding anything that resembled a dramatic confrontation, focused instead on securing what needed to be preserved. By 3:20 a.m., federal inspectors arrived with an emergency order requiring that the flagged aircraft, its full maintenance history, related component records, and the current flight schedule all remain untouched pending review. The overnight staff reacted with visible alarm and called Lucas, who arrived minutes later, still adjusting his jacket, insisting loudly that this was an internal misunderstanding that didn't warrant federal involvement. Daniel asked directly who had authorized the morning flight despite a documented structural warning. Lucas hesitated, then said that decision required input from executive leadership before he could answer further.
Amelia received the call at her apartment near the airport at 3:47 a.m., irritated at first, briefly assuming this was some form of retaliation orchestrated by Mason out of spite. The moment she heard the words federal inspection, her irritation gave way to genuine alarm. She called her legal team, but their response offered little comfort. Once inspectors arrived with documented evidence in hand, obstructing their work would only compound whatever legal exposure already existed. By the time the sun rose fully over the runway, employees arriving for their shifts found the hangar entrance controlled by federal personnel rather than the usual morning crew. Every VIP flight scheduled that day had been canceled without explanation offered to waiting clients. Word spread quickly. The primary fleet had been suspended from operation. Maintenance records had been seized. Amelia arrived just after 7 a.m., her appearance hurried, her composure not fully in place. The moment she spotted Mason standing beside Daniel near the hangar entrance, she understood exactly who had set this in motion. She approached him directly, accusing him of sabotaging the company out of resentment over losing his job. Mason reminded her, without raising his voice, that she had told him to sue her if he wanted to. What unfolded here reached far beyond a personal dispute between the two of them.
Daniel asked Amelia to accompany his team into a conference room for formal questioning. Lucas tried to block Mason from entering as well, arguing a former contractor had no standing to be present. Daniel corrected him. Mason had provided the original documentation and retained the right to participate. Inside the same glass-walled conference room where Amelia had celebrated with investors less than a day earlier, Daniel displayed the evidence methodically on a screen. Photographs of the fracture, the internal warning emails Mason had sent, the falsified signatures, the employee who had left 7 months earlier but whose name still appeared on active inspections. Amelia watched each piece appear in sequence and began to understand that Mason had fabricated nothing. She asked whether a single discrepancy truly justified endangering hundreds of jobs across the company. Mason answered that a single discrepancy was often the visible edge of dozens of deeper failures hiding beneath it. Daniel announced that sufficient grounds existed to open a full investigation into Aeronova's maintenance practices and the decisions made by its leadership. Outside the conference room, staff members whispered amongst themselves, comparing notes on warnings they'd personally seen ignored. None of them had come forward the way Mason had. Amelia convened an emergency board session within the hour. Evelyn Sinclair, the longest-serving board member, asked pointedly why leadership hadn't disclosed safety concerns before federal investigators arrived unannounced. Amelia tried to frame Mason as a disgruntled contractor with a grudge. Evelyn immediately requested access to every internal warning email connected to the case. Lucas, sensing the conversation shifting away from him, drafted a memo suggesting Mason had tampered with inspection systems himself, manufacturing evidence to extort a larger settlement. He handed it to Amelia, hoping she'd present it to the board. For a brief, exhausted moment, she considered it.
It was Connor who finally stepped forward as a formal witness, choosing honesty over the fear that had kept him quiet for weeks. He told investigators directly that Lucas had instructed him to backdate inspection entries and had personally moved records out of the building overnight. Lucas turned on him immediately, calling him disloyal. Daniel separated the two men, ensuring Connor's statement would be recorded independently. Later that day, investigators reviewing Aeronova's internal servers uncovered a message instructing staff to preserve the flight schedule by any means necessary. It had been sent from Lucas's account. Amelia had been quietly copied on it, 4 days before the fracture was even discovered. Daniel placed a printed copy on the table and asked her to explain why she'd never responded. Amelia said she received hundreds of messages daily and couldn't personally review every operational detail. The answers sounded thin even to her. The investigation widened beyond N448AN, expanding to the entire fleet. Inspectors found maintenance records that looked pristine across multiple jets, while the physical condition of several airframes told a different story. One aircraft carried a documented history of unusual vibration during a prior flight, a warning dismissed at the time and never resolved. Mason assisted the technical team throughout, helping investigators interpret wear patterns untrained eyes might miss. He took no satisfaction from what they found. Each flaw reminded him how many passengers had boarded those aircraft without knowing how close they came to real danger. Evelyn informed Amelia the board had voted to suspend her operational authority for the duration of the investigation. Amelia absorbed the news in stunned silence. 1 day earlier, she'd commanded every decision inside the company. Now she couldn't enter her own hangar without authorization. Lucas attempted to leave the premises with his laptop still in hand, but airport security stopped him at investigators' request. Cornered, he turned his blame directly toward Amelia, insisting every decision he'd made had been driven by the performance targets she herself had set. A preliminary technical report confirmed what everyone already suspected. Had N448AN departed as scheduled, it would have faced a serious risk of structural failure once it reached cruising altitude. The Aviation Authority scheduled a formal hearing. Mason arrived not seeking revenge, but simply to lay out the sequence of events as clearly as the evidence allowed. He described the fracture, the falsified records, the demand that he sign a safety certification he knew to be false, and finally, the two words that had set everything else in motion. Aeronova's legal counsel attempted to undermine his credibility, drawing attention to his financial situation, suggesting a man under money pressure had every incentive to exaggerate a defect. Mason didn't flinch. Needing money would have given him every reason to sign off and collect his payment. He'd refused to do exactly that. The room grew quiet at the simplicity of the answer. Connor confirmed again that Lucas had directed him to alter inspection dates. Server records confirmed maintenance logs had been modified only after Mason submitted his original warning, closing off any argument that the documents had simply been imperfect from the start. Daniel summarized the findings without exaggeration. Aeronova had operated aircraft while aware of significant risk, falsified maintenance documentation, obstructed timely inspection, and endangered passengers who had no knowledge of any of it. The grounding order would remain in place. Seized records would stay under review. Portions of the case would move forward for deeper investigation. Amelia rose from her seat. For a moment, it seemed she might argue further. Instead, she turned to Mason and said quietly that she'd been wrong to dismiss him the way she had. Mason didn't offer immediate forgiveness. He told her an apology, however sincere, couldn't undo the danger those flights had carried before anyone outside the company knew to stop them. Lucas was escorted from the building after attempting to remotely delete files from a company server, deepening the legal exposure already building against him. He would later face both criminal and civil proceedings tied to the falsified records, his career ending under decisions he'd made trying to protect a schedule rather than the people who depended on it.
Amelia, by contrast, agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. Outside the hearing, she declined a prepared statement and spoke for herself, acknowledging that safety concerns had been raised and ignored, and that responsibility rested with her, regardless of who had physically altered the paperwork. In the weeks that followed, Aeronova remained partially grounded. Its market value fell sharply. Several longtime clients canceled contracts outright. The board demanded a complete restructuring, beginning with a new safety division answerable directly to regulators rather than internal executives chasing quarterly targets. Amelia sought out Mason weeks later at a small independent maintenance shop where he'd returned to steady work, arriving alone, without lawyers, without an assistant managing her image. She handed him the full payment he'd originally been owed, along with additional compensation the board had approved. Mason reviewed the documents carefully and signed only for the amount he'd rightfully earned. She offered him a position as the company's new director of safety. Mason declined, unwilling to become a symbol used to polish the company's damaged reputation. Instead, he set one condition of his own. If Aeronova genuinely intended to change, every technician on staff needed the authority to halt a flight the moment they identified a genuine danger, without fear of losing their job over it. Amelia agreed without negotiation. Sometime later, Aeronova resumed limited operations under an entirely new set of procedures, less impressive to outside observers, considerably safer for everyone who boarded those aircraft. Connor remained with the company through its restructuring, eventually earning a role within the safety division Mason had insisted upon. He often said that watching one man refuse to bend under pressure had taught him more about integrity than anything else in his career. Mason kept working much the way he always had, steady and unassuming, going home each night to Ruby, never chasing recognition, content simply knowing the aircraft leaving his hands were finally as safe as the people boarding them deserved. He never wanted to be anyone's hero. He wanted a fair wage, a safe aircraft, and the decency of being believed when he told the truth. What he got instead was contempt, humiliation, and two careless words meant to put him in his place. Instead, Those words became the reason a private aviation empire was forced to face the law it had quietly ignored for far too long. If this story moved you, carry Mason's calm resolve into your own life. Stand firm when it matters, and trust that honesty, given enough time, still finds its way to the light.